Hi, I'm Dr. Alan Einstein, and I'm a physician who treats diabetes, metabolic syndrome, and hypertension. There's really a three-pronged approach to the treatment of diabetes and metabolic syndrome. The first being medication treatment, followed by exercise, and the importance of a good nutritional diet.
For 150 years, the conventional wisdom was that starches, sweets, highly refined carbohydrates make you fat. Again, I've been sugar, flour, bread, pasta, potatoes, rice, beer. These foods make you fat. That's what people believe. That's what our mothers believed. That's what our grandmothers believed. It only changed in the 1970s. It changed without any evidence. It changed because a group of very dedicated but zealous men believed that dietary fat caused heart disease. So they wanted us to eat less fat and more carbohydrates, more of the foods that people believed were fattening. Since then, there's been an obesity epidemic and a diabetes epidemic. Okay, if you don't eat these foods and you lose weight, you're probably getting healthier.
Oh, I think you just have to talk to anybody, any practitioner that's applied a low-carb diet to a diabetic patient to know how brilliantly that works. And it just makes you wonder why it isn't the standard treatment. So I think there will be, it eventually has to be. I just can't see how people can ignore it forever, although they've been doing a pretty good job up until now.
You know, the medical literature is pretty clear that low-carb diets are vastly superior for weight loss, for reducing the putative risk factors for heart disease. I mean, people really don't know that fat and cholesterol are related to heart disease. Those are just hypotheses. But even so, even if they're found to be true, low-carbohydrate diets still make those better. They stabilize blood sugar, they reduce blood pressure, they bring about a plethora of good effects. And when you bring this up to people that are kind of low carbohydrate naysayers, what they always say is, well, where are the long-term studies? Sure, these things work in the short term, but where are the long-term studies? And I always respond, where are the long-term studies of low-fat diets? Show me one of those. The only long-term study we've got is the standard American diet, and it's wretched.
You know, there are no long-term studies for carbohydrate-restricted diets. There were no studies, and certainly no long-term studies for fat-restricted diets when they set us on this path of low-fat diets that we're on today. It's impossible to do those studies. You know, at the end of my book, this is one of the recommendations. I said, look, spend $1 billion to do the damn study. Let's put an end to this. People are going to be arguing about this 20, 30 years from now. They wanted to do a study of low-fat diets in the 1960s. They decided it was too expensive. You know, and when I say study, I mean a long-term, large-scale, randomized control trial of low-fat diets versus higher-fat diets. Had they spent $1 billion in the 1960s, they would have had the answer by the early 1980s, and they would have known that probably would have known that what they've been recommending as a healthy diet for the past 30 years is an unhealthy diet.
Well, I don't know that there are long-term studies of processed foods. In fact, I rather doubt that there are. In fact, I would be willing to bet large amounts of money that there aren't any long-term studies of processed food. And it's the same thing with drugs. I mean, the FDA doesn't require long-term studies of drugs. The long-term studies come when they make it through the FDA and people get out and start taking them. Then you get the long-term studies, and sometimes you don't like what you find and they pull the drugs from the market. But there really are no long-term studies for any of these things.
Several studies now, I think probably over a dozen intervention trials in both men and women, both overweight and normal weight, and most recently looking at some clinical populations now, in particular focusing on folks with metabolic syndrome. And I guess to summarize that 10 years of research, if I could synthesize that as succinctly as possible, what we've learned is that these diets are very palatable and have relatively consistent effects on improving a number of cardiovascular risk factors. In particular, those that we categorize as metabolic syndrome, which include improvements in triglycerides, HDL cholesterol, LDL particle size, glucose, insulin levels, in addition to a range of other more ancillary features of metabolic syndrome, including inflammation, vascular function, even a range of endocrine markers that are all consistently improving on low carbohydrate compared to low fat diets.
Yeah, the side effects of the drugs being used for diabetes are myriad. You've got loss of libido, you've got increased risk of heart attack, you've got just a plethora of side effects with these drugs. And the sad thing is that they're not really needed in most cases, because if people will just change their dietary behavior, they can solve all these problems without the side effects.
I tell them to read Gary Taub's book. I think if you read Gary Taub's book and understand it, it gives you the basis to shuck off, throw away all these preconceptions that have been implanted in your mind about the harm of fat, the harm of low-carb diets, and so on. I think it's important to understand the basic stuff, the principles, the science behind it.
We have an obesity epidemic, we have a diabetes epidemic. It coexists with the argument that the healthy diet is a diet that's low in fat and high in carbohydrates. So maybe we have to examine, go back and really re-examine all our beliefs and, design experiments that will test them specifically. And then the results of those experiments get interpreted without bias, and you get them published in some place like the New England Journal of Medicine instead of the journals that these people don't read anyway. Until that happens, I can't see any great change.
Well, so many people have tried low-fat diets and I think are left very disappointed with the results. And I would highly encourage people to try carbohydrate restriction, despite the fact you don't get a lot of support from the government, you don't get a lot of support necessarily from physicians and dietitians. And this is very unfortunate, because this is a real solution for a lot of people.
There's not really anyone out there that I would not recommend a carbohydrate-restricted diet to.
We're amidst an obesity and diabetes epidemic now, and so we have to regain the public's trust, and that's not an easy task, but I think being honest with them, not oversimplifying messages is a good place to start, and I think they can handle the truth, and they deserve the truth.